The Queen Mother was often described as priceless, which was a convenient word because it meant nobody had to talk about what she actually cost. Priceless smile, priceless service, priceless link to the war, priceless grandmother of the nation. The word did everything. It honored her, it elevated her, and it quietly closed off any line of inquiry that might lead somewhere uncomfortable. You can't put a number on priceless. That is rather the point. But behind the priceless woman were very real bills. Houses, horses, staff, clothes, parties, travel, alcohol, jewels, overdrafts, suppliers, and a style of aristocratic living that belonged to a world where debt wasn't shameful, as long as the right people carried it quietly. When she died on 30 March 2002, aged 101 at Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, the public was told to mourn a symbol. Over 1 million people queued to walk past her lying in state coffin at Westminster Hall. Crowds of 400,000 gathered outside Westminster Abbey for the funeral. The tributes were vast and largely uncritical, but buried under those tributes was a question nobody was asking very loudly. How could a woman surrounded by reported debt also leave behind jewels, trusts, inheritances, and sealed papers the public was never allowed to properly inspect? The answer is a system, one built specifically to make that question disappear. Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon was born on 4 August 1900, the 9th child of the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn. The family seat was Glamis Castle in Angus, pink-turreted, centuries old, set in parkland that had belonged to the family since the 14th century, and expensive to maintain in ways that consistently outpaced the family's liquid income. Hugo Vickers, who wrote a biography of her published by Hutchinson, noted that the Strathmores didn't have a lot of money compared to the grandest tier of the peerage, a telling observation from a sympathetic biographer, made in the context of explaining her character rather than critiquing it. The family always put their money into land or property, per one account of the Bowes-Lyon history. American money had already been used to shore up other decaying Scottish properties of the period. The Strathmores were wealthy in the way that old aristocratic families were wealthy, in land, castle, and connection. Cash was a rather different matter. She married Prince Albert, Duke of York, in April 1923. The honeymoon was spent at Polesden Lacey in Surrey, a 1,600-acre estate belonging to a wealthy society hostess named Margaret Greville, who had gifted the use of it to the young couple. That particular connection would matter again later in ways neither woman could have fully anticipated. The abdication crisis of December 1936 transformed her husband into King George VI and her into Queen Consort. What followed was, by any measure, a public relations masterclass, not deliberately engineered, but structurally useful to the monarchy in ways that would outlast the war by 60 years. In September 1940, German aircraft struck Buckingham Palace 9 times during the Blitz. The King and Queen remained in London rather than evacuating to the countryside, as many aristocratic families had done. 13 September 1940, specifically, saw a German bomber drop its payload directly on the palace. The King and Queen were in the building. The phrase that circulated afterwards, about being able to look the East End squarely in the face, captures the wartime calculation with precision. If the palace could be bombed, royalty had shared the nation's suffering. Multiple wartime histories confirm the 9 direct hits. The precise origin of that exact phrase is disputed across historical accounts, with some sources noting varying explanations of how this phrase came about. What isn't disputed is the underlying fact, or its lasting emotional power. She stayed in London. The East End noticed. The press reported it. Decades of public affection followed. One academic study on the public image of the British royal family notes that the Queen Mother used to be perceived in a consistently positive way, with any deviation from that perception treated as a rupture rather than a reassessment. Scholarly work on her later decades describes her as having become a marginal figure, the guardian of outdated protocols in extreme old age, before her death and funeral briefly restored her to public prominence, as one book on royal funerals puts it. The funeral completed the image cycle that the Blitz began. The British press, operating under a long culture of deference toward the royal family, a pattern documented across media scholarship on the decline of deference in the late 20th century, was largely reluctant to probe. The Independent ran a piece during her lifetime headlined, "Carry on spending, ma'am, we're used to it," confirming the overspending was known to at least some editors before her death. The same paper reportedly carried a story on her expenses, sparking a row with the Treasury. But sustained critical coverage remained the exception rather than the rule. For most of the 50 years between 1952 and 2002, she was largely exempt from the financial scrutiny that would be applied to any other public figure spending parliamentary funds at a structural loss. Being priceless, it turned out, meant never having to show your accounts. Vickers himself captured the difficulty at the heart of any attempt to examine her closely. She was, he observed, a subject where the real person gets hidden behind the perceived image. That observation applies with particular force to her finances, where the perceived image was so thoroughly maintained and so emotionally impenetrable that questions about the gap between her income and her expenditure felt almost indecent to raise while she lived. Aristocratic debt in Victorian and Edwardian Britain was a structural feature of the landed class, not a personal failing or a moral weakness. David Canadyne's scholarship on the British peerage, in works including on aspects of aristocracy and the decline of the class more broadly, documents how the landed gentry maintained establishments dramatically beyond their liquid income, sustained by land values, family trusts, extended credit with tradespeople, and the social understanding that the right sort of creditor would wait. One academic study of aristocracy and commercial credit in England, covering the period up to the early 19th century, states the underlying logic plainly. The aristocracy often regarded debt to tradespeople as a mere inconvenience and neglected their payments. A separate study noted that high levels of debt sat comfortably with tradesmen's relations in aristocratic circles. The prestige of serving great families was itself a form of compensation, whether or not the invoice arrived on schedule. Lawrence Stone's work on aristocratic centuries documents that the total mortgage debt secured on English land was a structural constant. Debt carried comfortably at scale, across generations, as a normal operating condition of the landowning class rather than an emergency. The aristocracy had developed across centuries an intimate and complex relationship with credit. They ran accounts with wine merchants, tailors, jewelers, upholsterers, and provision dealers, on terms that no ordinary tradesperson would have extended to an ordinary customer. The compensation was prestige, association, and the occasional royal warrant. The invoice could wait. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon married into a family that operated this system at its most extreme expression. The British monarchy had its own version of the same architecture, scaled up by Parliament, bolstered by constitutional precedent, and surrounded by additional layers of legal protection that no ordinary aristocrat could access. What she brought to the monarchy wasn't a fortune, but a disposition, a class disposition shaped by generations of people who understood that large-scale expenditure, long credit, and the quiet absorption of costs by suppliers and family networks were simply how things worked among the right people. When George VI died in February 1952, leaving her a widow at 51, She carried that disposition into 50 years of solo widowhood, with no husband to moderate it. The paper trail that eventually emerged suggests rather little inclination to moderate it herself. The ledger of her life after 1952 is striking, not because any single item on it's inexplicable. Taken individually, each has a precedent in royal or aristocratic practice, but because of the cumulative total and what that total sat against. She maintained 5 residences: Clarence House in London, Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, Burke Hall on the Balmoral estate in Scotland, Castle of Mey on the northern coast of Caithness, and Walmer Castle in Dover. 5 properties for one person in permanent widowhood. The Castle of Mey deserves to be slowed down because the scene of its acquisition captures something important about how she thought about money. In the summer of 1952, recently widowed and staying with friends in Caithness, the northernmost stretch of the Scottish mainland, wind-scoured, looking out across the Pentland Firth toward Orkney, she came across what was then called Barragill Castle, a property in semi-derelict condition that its owner, a Captain F.B. Imbert Terry, was preparing to abandon. She stopped. She looked at it. And she wrote to her treasurer, Sir Arthur Penn, a letter that has since become one of the most cited documents in any account of her character. "When I was staying up in Caithness," she wrote, "I passed a dear little castle down by the sea, and when I visited it, I discovered it was going to be sold for nothing, just the value of the lead on the roof. This seemed so sad that I thought I would buy it and escape there occasionally when life becomes hideous. The old man who has lived there a long time was very anxious to give it to me, but I resisted the kind gesture, and he has now offered it to me for £100. It might be rather fun to have a small house so far away. The air is lovely, and one looks at Orkney from the drawing room. The only sad thing is that part of the roof was blown off in the great gale last January, and I shall have to put in electric light, of course. The grid runs past the door, luckily. Do you think me mad?" Her treasurer presumably did. The castle had no electricity, no running water. A section of the roof had been carried off by a winter storm. Every source describes it as semi-derelict at purchase. Exactly how much it cost can't be confirmed from any primary record. The £100 figure is cited consistently in tabloid sources, and several others suggest she may have paid even less, or accepted the property as a near gift. The Sun's headline has her paying £100 for and giving away for free. The Castle of Mey's own website notes that no one knows for sure how much the Queen Mother's castle in Scotland cost her. What is confirmed is that she then spent her own funds installing electricity, running water, and modernizing the interiors over the following 3 years, before restoring its original name from Barragill to the Castle of Mey. She owned it from 1952 until 1996, when she transferred it with an endowment to the Queen Elizabeth Castle of Mey Trust. Princess Margaret called it Mummy's Draughty Castle and refused to sleep inside, boarding on the royal yacht when visiting. King Charles III visits it every summer to this day. One mystery tycoon, unnamed in any source, reportedly gifted the royal family £150,000 for window replacements at the castle at some unspecified point during her ownership. The Queen Mother declined to replace worn carpets and curtains during her stays, renting a television set rather than buying one, a detail that sits with notable irony against the wider picture of her expenditure. Castle of Mey was the only property she ever personally owned. Her other 4 residences were, in different ways, part of the royal household infrastructure she inhabited. Clarence House was the other end of the scale from romantic impracticality. Her official London residence was staffed by approximately 60 permanent employees, of whom 27 lived on the premises rent-free. The annual wage bill for those Clarence House staff alone came to approximately £1.5 million, a secondary figure, but one consistent across multiple accounts and, even treated as an estimate, establishes the core structural problem with crystalline clarity. Her parliamentary income, the civil list annuity set by primary legislation, was £643,000 per year. This figure isn't an estimate. It's in the primary legislation. The civil list, Increase of Financial Provision Order 1990, signed by Margaret Thatcher on the 12th of October 1990 and coming into force on the 1st of January 1991. Article 3 of that order reads, "The yearly sum mentioned in Section 3 of the Civil List Act, 1937, provision for Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, shall be increased to £643,000. The figure remained unchanged until the Civil List was abolished in 2011. It had previously been £334,400, raised from £95,000 in 1972, after Edward Heath's Conservative cabinet rejected a proposed increase to £140,000, and before that from £70,000. In 1972, the cabinet had drawn a line. The Queen Mother's actual spending was drawing a rather different one. The arithmetic does not require creativity. The wage bill for her London household alone, one of 5 residences, ran at more than twice her entire parliamentary income. Total household expenditure across all 5 residences ran, by secondary estimates, between £1.5 million and £2 million annually. The structural gap between income and expenditure was somewhere between £860,000 and £1.35 million every year. Not occasionally, every year. For the better part of 2 decades between the 1991 Civil List increase and her death in 2002. Racing added its own column. She owned up to a dozen racehorses at her peak. Annual racing costs ran at approximately £1 million, a sum that, notably, was covered by Queen Elizabeth II rather than from the Queen Mother's own funds. She compared the annual cost of maintaining each horse to the expense of sending a boy to Eton. Her most famous racing moment came in the 1956 Grand National, when her horse, Devon Lock, collapsed inexplicably on the run-in, meters from the finish line, in one of the most discussed and still unresolved incidents in national hunt history. Cheltenham's 2-mile championship chase was renamed the Queen Mother Champion Chase in her honor. It carries that name to this day, now sponsored by BetMGM and run with prize money of £400,000. A fitting commercial afterlife for a woman whose relationship with the racing industry's economics was, to put it mildly, asymmetric. Norman Hartnell was her primary couturier for 4 decades. He received a royal warrant in 1957, operated one of the largest couture houses in London, approximately 385 staff, at 36 Bruton Street in Mayfair, and dressed her across the full span of her public life. A doctoral study of the Hartnell archive at the University of Brighton confirms she was renowned for wearing Norman Hartnell, and describes a relationship in which she would take tea with the couturiers, the social transaction of commission woven into the fabric of royal visiting. What individual Hartnell commissions cost isn't documented in any public source. The design invoices aren't available. The relationship's financial scope remains closed. Her art collection at death was estimated by contemporary press reporting, including BBC News coverage from 2002, at approximately £35 million in total, including a Monet landscape valued at approximately £15 million. She favored Dubonnet and gin, and was fond of pink champagne. The central heating at Castle of Mey ran year-round. 80 permanent staff were employed across her residences at the time of her death. Some accounts say closer to 100. The two figures conflict. Both sit far above any number that could be sustained on a £643,000 annual income. The overdraft figure that has circulated since her death requires careful handling, not because the underlying reality is in doubt, but because the precise provenance of the specific numbers is harder to pin than most reporting acknowledges. The Guardian, on 31 March 2002, the day after her death, reported that her overdraft at Coutts Bank had shot up to £4 million. The Daily Express, in later coverage, cites the same £4 million in the context of her long relationship with the Royal Bank. Time magazine, writing in May 2010, noted that it was reported she had a £4 million overdraft with the Royal Bankers, using the passive voice throughout, without naming an original source. A Telegraph account refers back to an Observer story from 2002 as an early source for the figure. The Observer article itself isn't directly reproduced in accessible records, producing a pattern of citation that circles back on itself without a confirmed originating document. Multiple secondary accounts report that the overdraft grew from $4 million to $7 million at its peak, before being reduced, reportedly with direct financial assistance from Queen Elizabeth II, to approximately £4 million by the spring of 1999. Whether it accumulated again in the final 3 years before her March 2002 death isn't clearly resolved across sources. Some place the figure at £7 million at death, others maintain £4 million throughout. UPI reported a sum of $14 million in a January 2008 item, which appears to be a dollar conversion of a figure in the £7 to £8 million range. The figures conflict. What can be stated with confidence, drawing on contemporaneous 2002 reporting from The Guardian and subsequent corroboration from multiple UK outlets, is that an overdraft in the range of £4 to £7 million existed at Coutts, that the peak figure was closer to the higher end, and that it was reduced at some point before death with the Queen's assistance. Coutts, for those unfamiliar with the institution, isn't an ordinary bank. Founded in the 17th century, it's the private bank of the British royal family and of the British establishment more broadly. By the 1990s, already a brand that owed much of its prestige to exactly the kind of long, accommodating relationship it had maintained with exactly the kind of client the Queen Mother represented. The joke attributed to Queen Elizabeth II, reported by The Guardian and repeated in subsequent coverage, has the Queen saying that Coutts would have folded long ago but for her mother's overdraft. Every source that carries this line presents it as reportedly, attributing it to no primary occasion. No transcript, no diary entry, no confirmed account of when or where the Queen said it has been established. But it has circulated consistently since 2002, attributed to the same context in multiple outlets, and it captures something genuinely true about the dynamic. The bank and the client had an arrangement that worked for both, and a certain rueful clarity about the mathematics was permitted, privately, in the right company. William Shawcross published the official biography in 2009, 1,200 pages written with complete access to the Queen Mother's personal letters and diaries. A Times profile of Shawcross during the book's promotional tour recorded that he was exasperated when interviewers pressed him on the £4 million overdraft figure. The word exasperated is significant. It places the overdraft squarely inside the promotional conversation surrounding the official biography, confirming that the question was live and that Shawcross addressed it in some form. What he wrote about the overdraft in the text itself isn't available in accessible sources. The official biography, by the account of critics who reviewed it, tended to glide over the later decades. The Guardian's review noted that Shawcross trudges through the second half of her life. One decade glided into another, with a basic pattern of her days, weeks, months. The financial details of those decades remain largely in the institution's private archive, which is to say, in the sealed papers. One point requires precise correction of a detail that has occasionally circulated incorrectly. It was Queen Elizabeth II who settled the Queen Mother's debts after 2002, not Prince Charles. This is confirmed by the Telegraph and corroborated in multiple accounts, which describe her eldest daughter Elizabeth being able to quietly pay off her debts. The Queen did it without public announcement, without any accounting that became part of the accessible record, and without inheritance tax liability under the 1993 sovereign-to-sovereign arrangement, which will be addressed shortly. Sir Ralph Anstruther managed the Clarence House accounts as the Queen Mother's treasurer from 1961 to 1998, 37 years. The structural deficit, £643,000 in civil list income against £1.5 to £2 million in annual household costs, was the operating reality of nearly all those years, growing through the 1990s as the overdraft climbed from £4 million toward £7 million. Anstruther died in 2002, the same year as the Queen Mother. The figures he managed never became a subject of public accounting in his lifetime. Why royal debt operated differently from ordinary debt requires understanding the structural architecture surrounding it, because the architecture was specific, documented, and deliberately non-transparent. The civil list was a fixed parliamentary appropriation rather than a detailed annual accounting. The 1990 order raising the Queen Mother's payment to £643,000 is a public document, but what it does not require is any household-level breakdown of how that money was spent. Critics called for complete openness and transparency in royal finances during this period. The legislation required no such thing. The gap between what the civil list was and what transparent public accounting would have shown wasn't an accidental feature of the system. It was the system. Tax arrangements added another layer. Under the 1993 Memorandum of Understanding, negotiated with John Major's government, the arrangement routinely described as operating sovereign to sovereign, property passing between a consort's estate and the reigning monarch was exempt from inheritance tax. The Guardian reported at the time of the Queen Mother's death that her longevity had cost the taxpayer millions in lost inheritance tax revenue. Queen Elizabeth II inherited an estate reported by BBC News as approximately £70 million, works of art, jewels, house contents, and paid no inheritance tax on it. The £70 million is a reported estimate from BBC coverage in 2002. No official probate record is publicly available to verify or contradict the exact sum. The official record, such as it is, wasn't released. Then there is the 1994 trust, which may be the most structurally revealing single fact in the entire picture. In 1994, the Queen Mother placed approximately £19 million, described in one account as roughly two-thirds of her liquid fortune at that time, into a trust for her great-grandchildren, with distributions planned for beneficiaries at their 21st and 40th birthdays. This was years before her overdraft was reportedly reduced from its peak figure back toward £4 million with the Queen's assistance. When those assets entered the trust in 1994, they legally left her personal ownership at that moment. They couldn't be seized by creditors. They weren't part of any ordinary debt accounting. The Coutts overdraft was a personal liability, exposed to the personal ownership rules that would govern any ordinary creditor relationship. The trust wasn't. The assets in it were, from 1994 forward, legally the property of the trust rather than the person. The arithmetic this produces is pointed. She reportedly held a £4 to £7 million overdraft at Coutts while having placed £19 million into a protected trust several years earlier. This apparent contradiction isn't hypocrisy in the ordinary sense. It's the structure. Aristocratic and royal financial architecture has understood for centuries the distinction between personal liquidity and dynastic asset protection. The trust, the entailment, the legally protected family fund that sits beyond the reach of ordinary creditors. What made the Queen Mother's case unusual was only the scale, and the fact that parliamentary income was also in the equation alongside it. The distinction between personal assets and dynastic or entailed assets extends to the Duchy of Cornwall, to the royal collection, to the Crown Estate's institutional holdings. Multiple overlapping categories of wealth, each operating under different ownership rules, different tax treatments, and different disclosure regimes. In this architecture, the relevant question is never simply, how much does she have? The relevant question, the one the architecture is specifically designed to make unanswerable, is, which category is it in, and who has access to the accounting? The supplier question does not have a clean answer from the documentary record. No specific named case of a Queen Mother supplier waiting unduly for payment appears in any accessible public source. The Royal Collection inventories don't address commission payment terms. Hartnell's archive does not contain publicly accessible billing records for the royal commissions. The relationships between the Clarence House household and its warrant holders across decades of her widowhood aren't documented in any public-facing material. What is documented is the broader class pattern these relationships inherited. The aristocracy across centuries maintained informal understandings with tradespeople. Invoices ran long. Prestige compensated for patience, and the right to display the royal arms or a noble family's crest under by appointment was itself a commercial asset that offset slow payment schedules. Royal warrant holders, businesses granted the right to describe themselves as supplying the sovereign's household, operated within the extended version of this dynamic. The warrant was commercially valuable. An unpaid or slowly paid invoice was part of the cost of holding it, priced in reputation rather than cash. Whether the specific warrant holders supplying Clarence House in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s experienced the full range of that aristocratic credit culture isn't established in the public record. What can be said is that the structural conditions for it existed. A household running at a structural deficit, a tradition of extended supplier credit in aristocratic practice, and a prestige value attached to the royal warrant that made quiet accommodation economically rational for the businesses involved. On 15 September 1942, Dame Margaret Helen Greville died at her London property. She was 78. She had ascended from working-class origins, born in 1863, the illegitimate daughter of William McEwen, the Scottish brewery magnate who founded Edinburgh's Fountain Brewery, to become one of the most influential society hostesses of her era. When she discovered that her father wasn't a servant but a millionaire brewer, the social trajectory changed entirely. McEwen employed Margaret's mother, Helen, when their affair began. Years later, the pair married, and Margaret became McEwen's stepdaughter, the legal fiction that sanitized her origins. When McEwen died in 1913, he left her his enormous fortune. She had married Ronald Greville, the son of the second Baron Greville, in a transaction that traded her father's money for his father's name. The Grevilles had a revered reputation and a lack of funds, a combination that worked neatly. After McEwen gifted her and her husband the 1,600-acre Polesden Lacey estate in Surrey in 1906, she became the kind of hostess who could receive royalty, cabinet ministers, and European grandees on equal social terms. She did, regularly. Her guest lists across the Edwardian and interwar decades read like an intersection of Who's Who and the Court Circular. She had no children. She viewed Queen Elizabeth, who had honeymooned at Polesden Lacey in April 1923, just weeks after the wedding, as something close to a daughter. In her will, dated 1942, she bequeathed her entire jewel collection to Queen Elizabeth. All of it. More than 60 pieces. Jewelry historian Helen Molesworth, senior curator of jewelry at the Victoria and Albert Museum, describes the Greville collection as probably one of the most visually recognizable collections of private jewelry ever to be in the public eye. The appraisal and cataloging of it took place in the weeks following Greville's September 1942 death. The collection was physically delivered to the Queen in 1943, during the war, in a black tin box embossed with the initials MHG, the dead woman's monogram, pressed into tin as the container for pieces that had once sat in Boucheron's Paris showroom. Queen Elizabeth wrote to Queen Mary that Mrs. Greville had left her jewels. Despite apparent efforts to keep the bequest quiet, newspapers had reported it by January 1943, after probate was filed. The collection was too large, too distinguished, and too various to suppress. The confirmed pieces include the following: the Greville ruby necklace, made by Boucheron in Paris in 1907, worn by the Queen Mother at a Rideau Hall banquet in 1951, at the Swedish state visit in 1956, at the Greek state visit in 1963. The Greville emerald tiara, also Boucheron, dated to 1919, featuring brilliant and rose-cut diamonds set in platinum around 9 cabochon emeralds, not seen in public for more than 50 years until Princess Eugenie wore it on her wedding day at Windsor in October 2018. The Greville diamond tiara, known as the honeycomb tiara, commissioned at Boucheron in 1921 by Lucien Hertz, and made from diamonds originally set in a 1901 palmette tiara. Its geometric honeycomb pattern is pavé set, with round, brilliant diamonds in platinum and milligrain settings. In 1953, the Queen Mother had Cartier increase its height by rearranging clusters of brilliants on the top layer, adding 4 round brilliants from one of her own brooches, and crowning the piece with a large marquise at the apex. It's now worn regularly by Queen Camilla. The Greville teardrop earrings were made by Cartier in 1938, each earring featuring a triangular stud, an emerald-cut diamond in the middle, and a dangling, pear-shaped diamond, approximately 20 carats each, set in platinum. The Queen Mother wore them to the ballet in 2000, the year of her 100th birthday, alongside 2 other Greville pieces. The Greville chandelier earrings began as a Cartier commission in December 1918, described in Sir Hugh Roberts's The Queen's Diamonds as originally fancy-cut, brilliant drop earrings. Greville had them revised in 1922, adding 12 more stones, including 6 baton brilliants to extend their length. She had 10 more stones added in 1929, bringing them to their current extraordinary form: brilliant cut, half-moon, baguette, trapeze, baton, emerald, and pear-shaped diamond drops, all in platinum. The Princess of Wales wore them at the Royal Variety performance in November 2025. The Greville festoon necklace, made by Cartier in 1929, and significantly expanded by Greville in 1938 when she commissioned a 3-row section to attach to the original 2-row piece, creating a 5-row diamond necklace of extraordinary weight, now worn by Queen Camilla on state occasions. Royal commentator Amanda Matta puts the gap plainly: we don't really know the scope of the collection, which is so tantalizing, especially for royal jewelry. Since that was a private bequest, there could be so much more in that collection that we've never gotten to see. No complete public inventory of the trunk's contents has ever been published. No monetary valuation of the Greville collection at the 1942 bequest, at the Queen Mother's 2002 death, or at current market value, has appeared in any accessible source. The Royal Collection Trust does not release valuations. The jewels are described in cultural discussion as priceless. The word appears again. This is where the apparent contradiction in the Queen Mother's finances resolves itself forensically. She reportedly carried a Coutts overdraft of between £4 and £7 million in her later years. She simultaneously possessed an art collection estimated at approximately £35 million, personally held jewels of extraordinary but publicly unquantified value, and trust assets of £19 million placed outside ordinary debt accounting in 1994. The debt and the assets coexisted under different legal and financial regimes without either one being legible against the other in any public accounting. She wasn't secretly poor pretending to be rich. She was genuinely both, cash poor by the standards of her lifestyle, asset rich by almost any other measure, and the architecture of royal finance was designed specifically to sustain both conditions simultaneously. As Molesworth observed about the Greville pieces specifically, the collection has passed through royal hands for more than 80 years, and still, most people don't recognize what they're looking at, even though individual items like the honeycomb tiara, the Greville necklace, and the chandelier earrings have been worn by generation after generation. Visible, continuously displayed, publicly worn, and still, in terms of financial accounting, essentially invisible. When the Queen Mother died, her will was sealed. Not informally held back, legally sealed, pursuant to orders made by the President of the Family Division of the High Court of England and Wales in 2002. Those orders prohibited inspection without the President's personal consent. The will sits, per the available legal record, in a safe controlled by the President of the Family Division. The Evening Standard reported at the time that the Queen had invoked royal prerogative to keep the will private. BBC News reported in 2002 that the Queen had inherited the estate, with an estimated value of approximately £70 million, including works of art of which the most important will go on public view. Beyond that headline, the approximate size of the estate, the name of the heir, and the destination of some art pieces, the contents of the will, the full distribution of assets, the specific resolution of the Coutts debt, the complete picture of what the Queen Mother left and to whom aren't publicly known. The legal mechanism is Rule 58 of the Non-Contentious Probate Rules 1987. It permits any will, royal or otherwise, to be removed from public inspection by court direction. For ordinary citizens, a will becomes a public document once probate is applied for. Anyone can walk into a probate registry, pay a modest fee, and obtain a copy. For senior royals, an application to the President of the Family Division removes that document from public access without any member of the public or press being consulted, heard, or permitted to see the contents. Buckingham Palace selectively disclosed some details in 2002, the headline estate value, the fact of the Queen's inheritance. The will itself remained sealed in the President's safe, inaccessible to any independent scrutiny. In 2007, a legal challenge reached the High Court. The case, Brown v. H.M. Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, the executors of the estate, reference 2007, EWHC 1607, FAM, saw an applicant seek to inspect the sealed wills of the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret. The application was struck out as an abuse of process. The sealing held. The wills remain inaccessible. The most recent and legally documented instance of royal will sealing occurred in September 2021 in the matter of Prince Philip's estate. Sir Andrew McFarlane, President of the Family Division, ruled that Philip's will should remain sealed to protect the dignity of Queen Elizabeth II, given her constitutional role. Previous orders had sealed royal wills indefinitely. McFarlane's ruling introduced a 90-year minimum before Philip's will could even be considered for unsealing, a process that, per published judiciary guidance, would be conducted by a professional archivist from the Royal Archives. The Guardian challenged the decision to hold the initial hearing in private. In July 2022, the Court of Appeal ruled that the judge was right to ban media from the hearing. The principle held, the financial contents of royal lives at the most senior level are sealed, by law, for the lifetime of anyone currently alive. The rationale the courts apply is privacy of the deceased and, for very senior royals, the protection of the reigning monarch's dignity and constitutional standing. These are legitimate legal arguments with genuine precedent behind them. The Duke of Windsor's will, sealed after his 1972 death, established a modern template. The Queen Mother's sealing in 2002 followed it. Philip's case in 2021 extended and codified it. Each step normalized the process further. What the process produces, in practical terms, is a financial picture of senior royal lives that is permanently inaccessible to the public whose parliamentary representatives set the civil list payments that sustained those lives in the first place. The word the courts use is dignity. The effect is opacity. Opacity, in this case, protects a story that was always somewhat difficult to explain plainly. The difficulty of explaining it plainly does not arise from dishonesty in the conventional sense. The Queen Mother wasn't running a fraud. She wasn't concealing money in the way that term is usually deployed. She was doing what aristocrats and royals have always done, living at a scale that assumed the costs would be absorbed somewhere in the vast financial architecture surrounding her: family, parliament, suppliers, trusts, while the public-facing narrative concentrated entirely on service, duty, and the image of a woman who stayed in London during the Blitz and came out smiling. The wartime image, the national grandmother framing, the priceless designation, these weren't cynically manufactured. The emotional reality of her wartime conduct was genuine. The affection of the million people who queued past her coffin was genuine. Most of them meant it. But those feelings were also useful. They made scrutiny seem unseemly. They framed any financial question as an attack on a symbol rather than a legitimate inquiry into how parliamentary funds and aristocratic habit had intersected across 50 years of widowhood. The Sovereign Grant Act of 2011 restructured royal finances, replacing the civil list with a percentage-based grant tied to Crown estate revenues, described at the time as the biggest reform to royal financial arrangements since the civil list was established in 1760. That reform came nearly a decade after her death. It does not reach back to illuminate what was spent, where, and against what gap between 1952 and 2002. The Treasury's annual accounts for those years don't contain household-level breakdowns of how the Queen Mother's civil list allocation was deployed or supplemented. The probate record is sealed. The trust records are private. The Hartnell invoices are in an archive. The Coutts ledgers are confidential. What exists is the 1990 order setting the figure at £643,000. The Guardian's contemporaneous 2002 reporting, placing the Coutts overdraft at £4 million, the multiple secondary accounts placing the peak at £7 million, the primary legislation governing the 1991 civil list increase, the documented delivery of the Greville jewels in a tin box in 1943, the 1994 trust placement of £19 million, the 1993 tax arrangement, and the 2002 sealing order that drew a line under the arithmetic. From those confirmed facts, the picture is clear enough, even if every figure at its edge carries an asterisk. The Queen Mother spent substantially more than she received from Parliament throughout her widowhood. The gap was covered by a combination of family assistance, primarily from Queen Elizabeth II, and a Coutts overdraft that ran for years in the range of millions. She simultaneously held assets of extraordinary value in jewels, art, and trust structures that operated outside ordinary debt accounting. When she died, the full ledger was sealed. The partial picture that emerged, an estate reported at approximately £70 million, inherited by the Queen, tax-free, told enough to raise the question, and not enough to answer it. The Queen Mother's secret wasn't that she spent money. Everyone near her finances knew that. Sir Ralph Anstruther knew it across 37 years of household management. Coutts knew it across decades of overdraft. Queen Elizabeth II knew it, and reportedly joked about it while quietly managing the gap. The Independent knew it well enough to run a headline on it while the Queen Mother was still alive. The secret was that the monarchy could make spending look like service, debt look like tradition, and secrecy look like dignity. Ordinary people die and leave accounts. Their estates go through probate. Their wills become public documents. Their creditors file claims. The arithmetic is visible to anyone with access to the probate registry. Royals die and leave legends. The Greville tiara passes to a new head. The Monet moves to the collection. The trust pays out on beneficiaries' birthdays. The will sits in the president's safe. The overdraft is settled quietly, and the 1993 arrangement ensures no inheritance tax touches any of it. The architecture that made all of this possible, the civil list without household-level disclosure requirements, the trust structures that separated assets from personal liability, the tax arrangement negotiated with John Major's government, the sealed probate orders under Rule 58, wasn't assembled in secret. Each piece is a matter of public legal record. The civil list order is on legislation.gov.uk. The 2007 court case is in the law reports. The 2021 Philip ruling was covered by the BBC. The structural opacity is itself transparent for anyone who assembles the parts and reads what they produce together. What the monarchy converted through this architecture wasn't merely expenditure into reputation. It converted a financial structure, one in which a woman spent substantially more than her parliamentary income for 50 years, accumulated millions in Coutts debt, sheltered millions in trust assets, and died leaving an estate of reported tens of millions that passed tax-free to her daughter, into a story about a woman who smiled at children, stayed in London during the Blitz, and loved horses. Both things were true. Only one of them was allowed to be the story. Somewhere between the unpaid deficit at Coutts, the jewels in the black tin box, the sealed court order, and the smiling photographs is the financial truth of the Queen Mother. A woman whose life was too expensive to explain plainly, and too useful to the monarchy to explain at all. The word priceless was never really a compliment. It was a boundary. It said, "Don't look for the price. The price has been decided. It's none of your business." If you want more stories that follow the money and the myths built around it, subscribe.